Hey, Mark from Intelligent Triathlon Training. How you going? Today I wanted to go through some of the intricacies of INSCYD and the software and the reports that we generate from that physiological assessment, just to give you a bit of an insight into the level of information they get back and a few quick comments on what we can do with it once we've got it. So let's dive right in now and have a little bit of a look. So in this video we're going to cover a few of the tabs, some of the information you get back. Just going to highlight what we're going to cover, and then we'll give you in the links below how you can fast forward, go straight to the relevant points if you're only interested in a certain graph or certain information. So first of all, we have metabolic capacities and VO2 max, VLA max, anaerobic threshold, your fat max and carbohydrate max, and we should be going through what they are. Then we'll move on to having a look at load characteristics. This is basically describing, all of these describe how your test goes on, how things progress through your physiological profile. We'll explain a little bit about what they are and how you can use them. Your fingerprint, metabolic fingerprint, is the snapshot. It's a highlight graph of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and you can then see how that progresses over time once you have a retest, and it gives you a quick indication. Performance development, well, I haven't got much performance development yet because I've only done one test, but in future there would be other data on there. And then finally we'll have a look at training zones and how they relate, how they might differ from some other training zones that you may have seen. So this is one of the first panels that we have, and on here you can see information about the athlete, me, the sport that the test was conducted in, who the coach is. I coached myself, funnily enough. The type of test that we did, in this case we were using blood lactate, destate, and we get a couple of the key variables that come out of it. So we've got VO2 max expressed in mils per kilo per minute, and a VLA max figure, and my weight. Underneath here, the first of these tabs here, so we won't go into body composition because we didn't measure any body composition, we just looked at body weight. Here we have metabolic capacities. And with these we've got VO2 max, VLA max, aerobic threshold, or anaerobic threshold, or FTP, critical power. Yeah, I know, and I've mentioned this a couple of times. They're not strictly speaking the same thing, but in the sort of real world, most people are using them fairly interchangeably. The academics will get a little bit upset, I'm sure. Then we have fat max over here on the right hand side, and in there we've got a couple of figures on some of these. So we've got the relative, obviously expressed relative to body weight, and then we've got the absolute, and then we've got the carb max. And what I want to do is just explain a couple of quick points on what these are. A couple of caveats. So there are three settings on this software. You're either classified as a pro, an amateur, or recreational. I've classified myself as recreational because I don't race. I haven't raced in 15 years, and I don't train specifically. I'm not. I just ride my bike and enjoy myself. So that I've classified myself as recreational. When I did one and I classified myself as amateur, then the relative position of these figures changed. So instead of being top level VO2 max, it put me down somewhere in the medium. So here we have VO2 max, so relatively speaking, 60.2 mils per kilo, and an absolute of nearly 5.3 litres per minute, or 5,200 millilitres, which as a recreational athlete puts you at a fairly high level. The VLA max, now we'll come on to more what VLA max is in the next graph, but mine sits at 0.51. Now on here, the very low to top level will depend very much upon what your objectives are. Now if an Ironman athlete had a VLA max in the top level, I'd be slightly concerned about the training that they're doing, because that's showing they've got a high anaerobic capacity. Similarly, if you had a cyclocross or a crit racer or something like that, or a sprint distance or a team relay athlete with a very low VLA max, then I'd also be very worried about that because they need that anaerobic capacity, that really high intensity work to be able to perform at a top level. Then we have the AT, anaerobic threshold, FTP, etc., etc., relative to body weight and absolute. So here you can see mine's come out 3.7 watts, 320 watts. Sorry, I can't speak today. 328 watts absolute, which occurs at 77.6 of my VO2 max, and that is important because this can be, where it appears relative to VO2 max can be influenced by things like your VLA max. So in an ideal world, you want that around sort of 80% more or less. So I'm not far off, but as an all-round athlete, around 80%. Again, crit racer, somebody with a high VLA max might be a little bit lower, and an Ironman athlete or ultra endurance, or somebody who does a lot of sportifs, that sort of thing, Gran Fondos would be probably maybe a little bit over 80. You'll be looking for a little bit over 80. Fat max. So there's a few different ways you can express fat max. So here we have relative to body weight, so at 5.58 kilocalories per hour per minute, per kilo, sorry, and it occurs at 215 watts. Again, we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the next graph, or next set of graphs. 490 calories, and this is the top end where I can perform at using the upper limits of human absorption of carbohydrates. So if I supplement during a long ride, for instance, you can absorb around a maximum of about 90 grams of carbs per hour. And for me, that power output occurs at 2.6 watts per kilo. Again, that'll make more sense in a minute. So let's move right on to that then, shall we? So this top left one here, we're looking at simple VO2 max. So it's uptake, so what I actually consumed, or what it calculated I actually consumed, and what the demand was. Now, as you can see, as the line starts to separate here, the pale blue line being the actual uptake and the dark blue line being the demand, then I'm unable to supply all of the oxygen required to meet the power output on the x-axis by aerobic metabolism. I'm starting to have to use my anaerobic or glycolytic engine to be able to produce that. And somebody with a higher capacity than mine would, there'd be a bigger differential by the time we get to the end here. And for somebody with a lower capacity, then it would be a shallower line, or a shallower gap between the two lines. On the bottom left-hand side, we have lactate production and maximum oxidation rates, and concentration. So with the let's start with the yellow one. So this is, it's not quite the same as curve. Have you ever done a step test and they take a blood lactate at the end of each stage? It's similar but not quite the same. So what this is representing is what would happen to the blood lactate if you maintained that intensity, power output, running speed for a long period of time. Because ultimately, because you're in a state where the lactate that's being produced is being cleared quite quickly, the actual value is quite low. Much lower than you'd actually see in a one-off reading at the end of a 4 or 6 minute stage. But you can see, so my FTP came out 328 watts, so we can see at around that sort of figure. After that point, you get a rapid increase in blood lactate, much more again than you would do on a step test. It's not the same graph, just to clarify that. So the red one is the production line. That's how much lactate is being produced at each stage, or at each power output. And then the blue line is the maximum rate at which you can burn the lactate that's been produced. If you want to find out more about what lactate is, and not about all the myths and things that lactate is an evil thing and it's the acid and it's what makes your legs hurt, it isn't. Lactate is produced as a part of carbohydrate metabolism. Hydrogen ions are what causes the pain, the discomfort of when you go over threshold, and therefore causes fatigue and stops you from exercising any further. If you want to find out more about that, then we're going to have a little bit more in-depth physiology. This is really just about explaining some of the graphs and how you can use them. Okay. So top right hand side on here we have two lines. We have a grey line which is below my threshold, and then a purple line which is above. So the grey line is what they term as lack of pyruvate, and it's heavily related to basically the way in which you can clear the lactate from the muscles, and where we see this apex here sort of hovering around the 200 mark up to sort of 225, the highest rate there. So in this example, I can clear at 220 watts, the highest rate I can clear lactate from my blood is at around that 210 watt mark, and it's at 0.55 millimoles per minute per litre of blood. When we go over threshold, it starts to accumulate, and you can't get rid of it anymore. You're gradually going to be accumulating it. And this line here relates to the gap between this blue line and the red line here. So just over threshold, there's not a lot. As you get further and further and further away, obviously the gap goes up, and this is what we see here. So from this we can calculate. So if I was to ride at 400 watts, for instance, then every minute I rode at 400 watts, I would be accumulating 1.37 millimoles per litre per minute. Let's have a quick look at the blue graph over here, the blue line over here. My peak lactate concentrations that I can sort of sustain or reach are around 8 millimole. So, in theory, we can work out from this graph, if I'm going to accumulate 37 millimole at 400 watts, it's relatively easy to work out how long I can hold 400 watts for. So this can be used in helping you to understand the consequence of going over threshold. So if you're a triathlete and you're on a hill, you've got to climb in the course, how far over threshold can you ride and for how long before it starts to become a big problem? Now if I sit at just over threshold, so let's say 340 watts, I'm only accumulating at 0.16 millimoles per minute, which means I should be able to sustain that for a very long, quite a long period of time. Now it's not going to be easy, don't get me wrong, there are other things that will start to affect that. One of which being the bottom right graph, which is how much carbohydrate I'm using at that particular moment. But in theory, that's how long you'd be able to go for. If we then want to calculate, for instance, some VO2 max efforts for you, people's lines are going to be different. So the way in which this purple curve it exhibits itself and the values that come with that are going to be very unique to each individual. So from that, you can start to set, or we can, if we're doing it for you, we can start to set intervals which are much more specific to your abilities, to your characteristics, and relative to the discipline and the events that you want to improve in. The bottom right graph, particularly useful for the longer endurance events when carbohydrate availability is a limitation. So from here we can see, so a couple of the lines look fairly familiar. So the orange line here is basically your carbohydrate oxidation rate, or how much carbohydrate you're using at any given power output. And the green line is your fat utilization. As we can see, at fairly low intensities, in my case, 50, 60, 70 watts, we're virtually burning nothing because there's no energy need for it. It's such a low intensity. Once we come up to around 200 watts, we start to get that peak rate of fat oxidation. So if we look at the line here on the crosshairs, so they're burning sort of 484 calories an hour, that sort of holds a really flat portion of the graph through there, all the way up to about 230 odd watts, 33 watts, 34 watts. And that's my fat max. So fat max would be the highest one of those. So what the software's come up with is the absolute apex of that there, and that creates my fat max. The green shaded line is the band that you would be operating in. So what is fat max? In a nutshell, fat max is the highest rate you can burn fats as your primary fuel source or as a fuel source. And the intensity or the power output, the work rate that goes with that is the work rate that point occurs at. If you want to ride, for instance, an Ironman, fat max is the zone you're going to spend most of your time in. Now you might pop out of it a little bit for a hill or a downhill, but ultimately you're going to be spending most of your time in that zone. And again, this can be very different. So you can have two people with the same FTP, but their fat maxes will be in very different places. And that will then obviously affect that Ironman or endurance rider's performance, especially if we moved a little bit above. So at that point there, at the top end of my fat max, I'm still burning a lot of fat, but I'm also starting to burn quite a lot of carbohydrate. So here I'm up to 102 grams, and I know I am a bit of a sugar muncher. So I know if I don't take on plenty of carbs during exercise, then I'm going to blow my doors off sooner or later. This just puts some more specific numbers to it. If we come all the way up to threshold, we see the green line's descended down to the apex, to the baseline, and it's 0, which is what happens at threshold. At threshold, the whole point there is you are now burning 100% carbohydrate. Now, if I was to ride at threshold for an hour and do, let's say, for argument's sake, a 25-mile time trial, I'm going to burn 284 grams of carbohydrate. Now, the maximum rate of human absorption is around 90 grams. Some studies suggest up to 100 grams, but anybody who's tried it knows the practicalities of trying to get 90 grams of carbs in an hour is pretty hard work. At 90 grams an hour, I've got a fairly significant deficit. Now, fortunately, your muscles and blood glucose and things like that provide some stores. You have stores on board already to start with. But if I came back a little bit and tried to ride midway between my fat max and my threshold, which is more like 70.3 pace, or sort of 2.5 to 3 hours, then you're looking at around, I'm looking at around 150 grams of carbs per hour. If I'm popping 90 back in again, I've got a deficit of something like 60 grams an hour, which is going to, by the time I've done a run and a swim on the front of that, I'm going to be getting pretty close to being empty. So that will help me to judge the efforts, how hard I can go, and how much fuel I need to get in to be able to do that, and obviously where my training needs to go. If I was looking at this and if I was trying to advise myself where my training needs to improve, I need to improve this. The fat max is my biggest limitation at the moment, and the amount of carbohydrates I consume pretty much all the way through is my biggest limitation for a longer distance endurance race. If we keep moving swiftly along, come along, so we've got a little fingerprint now. So it's just a snapshot of where category that you're putting yourself in, or we're putting you in. Then this is the limitations. Again, if I went to pro, this would not be at the top of the range. This would be somewhere near the bottom of the range. But I'm not racing pros, so it doesn't matter. So my VO2 max, relatively speaking, is pretty high. My VLA max is pretty low. And that is what we talked about earlier as being one of the key things. It's basically the measure of your anaerobic capacity. This is one of the big surprises for me, because I thought mine was going to be a bit higher than that, because I know as a rider I've got quite a good punch above my threshold. However, I also thought my threshold was lower than it actually is. So that'll probably explain why I thought I had a better punch, because I was putting my threshold as being 20 watts lower than it actually came out at. So I had to revise my expectations a little bit. You've got anaerobic threshold in terms of power relative to body weight and in absolute numbers. Now, because I'm relatively heavy, my absolute figure is not as good as my relative. My relative figure is not as good as my absolute. And therefore, if I lose a few kilos and manage to maintain my threshold, my absolute threshold at 328 watts, then this would start to creep towards the outside, simply because I've lost weight, and therefore my relative power output is better. Body fat's moderate, but again, that's just a standard figure that's been put in there because we didn't enter anything specifically for it. And my fat max in terms of absolute power output is sort of moderate. And therefore, you can see from these then where my strengths and weaknesses lie, but also particularly with the VLA max, knowing that I don't necessarily want it to be super high. That's not necessarily a good thing, although it can be. If we've got repeat tests and multiple tests, then we would obviously see on here how the key metrics have tracked and changed over time. And then we've got training zones. Now, these are, it looks like there's quite a lot of training zones on there. Don't worry about below 9. That gives any coach who wanted to use more zones or different zones, they can enter those things in there. And this is a slightly different way to looking at zone systems or zone power zones than some of the systems that maybe people may be familiar with. So, for instance, they're not necessarily all sequential. So the zones are describing a type of training or a level of intensity. So, for instance, the first two are obviously sequential. So we've got recovery zone 120 to 170 watts, or base training, so my long endurance mileage somewhere between 170 and 219. And then all of a sudden we've got nothing. So 219 to 239, there's 20 watts that don't exist there. They are what people might call the grey zone or junk. It's solid, it's hard, but it's not that hard. And it's just wasting your time basically. And here we have medium zone, and that is quite a large range. And that's going to roughly correspond to something between tempo and sweet spot training, if you're familiar with those terms. So it's quite a large zone, but that's the sort of that high-end aerobic work, long distance reps where you're doing 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes, up to sort of 2 hours of riding at that sort of intensity. It's also where any sort of 70.3 or Ironman intensity is going to come in. Then we've got go back down again, so we've gone down to 195 to 237. So this is if I wanted to work on fat max. So this is the key areas that I'd want to be in. If I wanted to go longer, if I was doing a long session, 3, 4, 5 hours maybe, then I'd obviously want to be towards the lower end of this range. If I was doing a shorter, I've only got an hour to spend, but this is the area I want to be training in, I can work up to that sort of 237 mark. Then we've got the anaerobic FTP threshold. So we're anywhere in this sort of range here, depending upon the type of intervals or the type of reps that you're working on. So you can influence. So with that, this is sort of 90%, just over 90% FTP, with an FTP anaerobic threshold of 328. So and obviously that's just over it. So again, quite a broad zone because different types of intervals will require different intensities, but that's the area you'd be working in. Then we've got maximum aerobic power, which is roughly what you can hold for somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, really. And that's sort of an indication of it. And that's working at around that VO2 max type power. And then above that, we've got high-end anaerobic power work as well, so which would be shorter than that, down to sort of maybe a minute's worth of intervals on and off. And again, depending upon how you do them, would depend upon what those figures would be within that session. And then, so another slightly broader zone, the lactate shuttling zone. which again is used more specifically for sub-interval training. Now in these first few zones we also get the average, so looking at the target figure here, this is the calorie consumption. So if you were training, if I were training at 200 watts, then I'd be consuming something like 769 kilocalories per hour, of which 63% is going to be fat, 37% is going to be carbohydrate, which means I'm burning 68 grams of carbs an hour. So if I'm on a 4-hour steady ride, and it's relatively flat, or I'm very good at holding a fairly constant power and not doing massive surges on every climb, then I can probably assume that I'm going to burn around 68 grams of carbs. I don't need to replace all of that because hopefully through my diet I actually have somewhere between 400 and 500 grams on board already. But I might need to keep that topped up because I am a bit of a sugar burner. Some people's figures here would be much, much lower for the same relative intensity. Because I am a sugar burner, then I need to keep a little bit going in. Now, that comes on to what you can do in terms of training. Now, of course, one of the things I might want to do from this, if I wanted to develop my Ironman bike performance, would be working on my fat-burning abilities, and we can set programs which challenge that a lot more. You can look at your diet and your nutrition. Obviously, you can see from this, so if we go up to the fat max zone, so although it's my fat max zone and I'm burning fats at the highest rate, I'm also burning quite a lot of sugar, carbohydrate at the moment as well. So I need to be cautious of that in my training programs. So I hope that's all been useful for you and answered a few questions. If you have more questions, then please get in touch. Check out our website, itt.world, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, see you next time.